June 6, 1944 did not feel like defeat in Berlin. Not at first. Maps still hung straight on the walls. Telephones still rang. Officers still spoke with confidence they no longer deserved. Hitler was told the landings were a distraction, a feint, another Allied trick. After all, how could one nation break Fortress Europe? But as reports stacked higher, as units stopped responding, as the truth crept in through static-filled radios, Hitler realized something chilling. This wasn't an American attack. It was an Allied war. And Germany was facing all of it at once. Before we go deeper, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the world. Now, let's go back to the moment everything began to unravel. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Adolf Hitler was asleep. That fact alone would shape history. While Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, German high command hesitated. Not because they lacked information, but because they lacked permission. In Hitler's Germany, no major armored movement happened without the Führer's approval, and the Führer was unreachable. Inside the Wolf's Lair, staff officers whispered. Phones rang unanswered. Couriers waited. Reports from the French coast were arriving fast now. Paratroopers sighted inland, naval bombardments along the shore, air activity heavier than anything seen before. Still, many German commanders believed what they had been trained to believe, that Normandy was a diversion. For years, German intelligence had been conditioned by Allied deception. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, phantom armies. All of it pointed to Pas-de-Calais as the true invasion site. Normandy, they told themselves, was too obvious. Hitler had reinforced that belief personally. He was convinced the Allies would strike where the channel was narrowest. Anything else felt illogical. And Hitler trusted his instincts more than any general. So when Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt requested permission to move panzer divisions toward Normandy, the answer was delayed. Hours passed. On the beaches, Allied troops paid for that delay with blood. In Berlin, the situation was still being framed as manageable. Staff officers spoke carefully, choosing words that would not provoke Hitler's anger. They described the landings as limited, containable, still developing. But beneath the language, something darker was forming. This was not just an American operation. Yes, American forces were landing at Omaha and Utah, but British troops were pushing inland at Golden Sword. Canadian divisions were fighting hard at Juno. Free French forces were already active behind the lines. This wasn't a single hammer. It was a coordinated machine, and Hitler had underestimated it. When he finally awoke and received the briefing, his response was not panic. It was irritation. He believed the main invasion had yet to come. "Where is Patton?" he reportedly asked. That question revealed everything. Hitler was still fighting the war he wanted, not the war unfolding in front of him. By midday, the scale became harder to deny. Thousands of ships, endless aircraft, entire divisions ashore. This was not a raid. This was not a probe. It was liberation in motion. German units on the ground began reporting something unsettling. They weren't just facing Americans. They were facing British discipline, Canadian coordination, Polish pilots overhead, and resistance fighters feeding intelligence to Allied commanders in real time. For the first time, the Reich was confronting a truth it had tried to divide and dismiss. The Allies were united, and unity was something Nazi Germany had never truly prepared to fight. Hitler still hesitated. He ordered panzer units to hold. He feared committing reserves too early. He feared deception more than reality. But reality does not wait. By evening, Allied beachheads were secure. Not flawless, not painless, but irreversible. And somewhere between denial and fury, Hitler began to understand. D-Day was not an American war. It was an Allied one, and Germany no longer controlled the tempo. By the afternoon of June 6th, the illusion was breaking. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces. German field commanders were no longer speaking in theories. They were speaking in shortages, ammunition running low, communications failing, units cut off from each other by air power they couldn't challenge. Above Normandy, the sky belonged to the Allies. Aircraft moved freely, methodically. Bombers struck roads and rail lines far beyond the beaches, isolating German reinforcements before they ever reached the front. Fighter planes hunted anything that moved in daylight. German officers noticed something else too. This wasn't chaotic. This wasn't rushed. Every Allied move felt rehearsed. British forces secured key bridges with precision. Canadian units advanced with discipline, holding ground instead of chasing glory. American troops, despite heavy resistance, kept pushing inland with stubborn determination. Different styles, same objective. Unity. In Berlin, the tone of reports shifted. Words like limited disappeared, replaced by widespread, sustained, coordinated. Hitler listened in silence now. Maps were updated again and again. Red pins marking Allied positions crept inland. Not far, but enough. Enough to matter. Still, Hitler clung to the idea of a second, larger invasion. He believed the Allies would not commit everything to Normandy, that somewhere Patton's army was waiting to strike the real blow. This belief paralyzed him. Panzer divisions sat idle, engines cold, waiting for an order that never came. Commanders argued. Some wanted immediate counterattacks. Others warned that Allied air superiority would destroy any movement. Both sides were right, and that was the problem. Meanwhile, Allied commanders made decisions quickly. They adjusted plans, redirected units, reinforced weak points. If one beach stalled, another compensated. If one unit slowed, another advanced. No single leader controlled everything, and that made the machine harder to break. By nightfall, German commanders at the front stopped asking for permission. They asked for clarity, they didn't get it. Hitler's orders were contradictory. Hold ground, but don't commit reserves. Counterattack, but avoid exposure. Trust the plan, but prepare for the unexpected. For the first time, his authority became a liability. Field Marshal Rommel was not present. He was in Germany, believing the invasion would come later. Another miscalculation, another delay. When Rommel finally understood the scale of what was happening, it was already too late to stop the momentum. Across the Channel, Allied ships continued arriving. Wave after wave, men, supplies, vehicles, fuel. This wasn't a landing anymore. It was a pipeline. German intelligence intercepted radio chatter from multiple Allied nations. Different accents, different codes, all synchronized. The realization hit hard. This was not America acting alone. This was Britain returning, Canada asserting itself, France rising again, and America supplying the weight, an alliance tested and functioning. Hitler had built his strategy on division, political division, racial division, national division. Now he was facing the opposite, and it shook him. That night, as reports continued arriving, Hitler withdrew, not physically, mentally. Witnesses later described him pacing, staring at maps too long, repeating questions already answered, searching for proof that this could still be contained. But the truth was simple. The Allies didn't need to win everything that day. They only needed to stay, and they did. By the early hours of June 7th, Normandy was no longer a question, it was a foothold. And for the first time since the war began, Hitler was reacting instead of directing. The balance had shifted quietly, irreversibly. By June 7th, the language inside German headquarters had changed. There were no more debates about deception, no more theories about secondary landings. Normandy was real, and it was growing. Allied forces were no longer just holding the beaches. They were linking them, expanding outward, turning sand into supply routes and hedgerows into defensive lines. What had begun as separate landings was becoming a single front. That fact unsettled Hitler more than the numbers. He had always believed the Allies would struggle to cooperate, that egos would clash, that national interests would fracture decision-making. Instead, the opposite was happening. British engineers cleared roads with precision. Canadian units advanced methodically through heavily defended villages. American forces absorbed losses and kept moving forward. No one waited for credit. They waited for results. Hitler's response was not rage. It was withdrawal. He stopped holding long conferences. He issued fewer direct orders. When he did speak, he returned to familiar phrases: faith, willpower, destiny. But destiny doesn't answer radios. German commanders on the ground began acting independently, something unthinkable earlier in the war. They repositioned units without approval, pulled back when necessary, preserved forces instead of sacrificing them for ideology. It was subtle, but it mattered. The chain of command was bending. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence intercepted German communications that told a clear story. Confusion, delay, hesitation. The same system that once crushed Europe through speed and initiative was now trapped by its own rigidity. Hitler had centralized everything, and now everything waited on him. In Normandy, Allied artillery spoke continuously, not wildly, but deliberately. Fire was measured, targets prioritized. The objective was not spectacle, it was pressure. And pressure works differently than shock. It exhausts, it limits options, it forces mistakes. German units found themselves defending ground that no longer mattered, while Allied forces focused on roads, bridges, and junctions that controlled the future. This was modern warfare at its most coordinated. Back in Germany, propaganda struggled to keep pace. Radio broadcasts insisted the situation was under control. Newspapers framed the landings as costly for the Allies, but soldiers writing letters home told a different story. They described endless aircraft, constant movement, an enemy that didn't retreat when expected. Hitler read some of these reports, and he stopped commenting. Witnesses later recalled long silences, meals left untouched, maps studied without direction. He had built his worldview on dominance through fear and fragmentation. Now he was facing a coalition built on trust and shared purpose. That realization cut deep. By June 8th, Allied commanders were no longer asking if the invasion would succeed. They were planning what came next. Ports, not cities. Paris, the scope widened. And with it, the meaning of D-Day transformed. It was no longer about beaches. It was about momentum. Hitler attempted one final conceptual defense: that the Allies would overextend, that logistics would fail, that unity would crack under pressure. But every day that passed proved otherwise. Supplies flowed steadily. Command remained flexible. Decisions adapted to reality, not ideology. The Allies didn't need perfection. They needed cooperation. And that was something Nazi Germany could not counter. In private, Hitler reportedly admitted something he had never accepted before. Germany could not fight the entire world indefinitely. He had misjudged scale, he had misjudged resolve, and most critically, he had misjudged unity. D-Day wasn't just an invasion, it was a demonstration that no single nation carried this war alone, and no single man could stop what came next. By the second week after D-Day, there was no question left to answer. The Allies were not being pushed back. They were advancing, slowly, methodically, relentlessly. Normandy had transformed from a contested landing zone into a living supply network. Roads once marked with German checkpoints now carried Allied convoys. Temporary airstrips appeared almost overnight. Wounded soldiers were evacuated efficiently. Reinforcements arrived with calm regularity. This was not desperation, this was sustainability. For Hitler, that realization marked a quiet collapse. Not the dramatic kind history often imagines. No shouting, no sudden confessions. Instead, it came as resignation disguised as stubbornness. He continued issuing orders, but fewer were followed exactly. Generals interpreted rather than obeyed. Field commanders adjusted reality faster than Berlin could deny it. The Führer's greatest strength had once been decisive control. Now it was a delay. Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs drained Germany's remaining flexibility. Divisions were pinned defending symbolic ground while the Allies focused on mobility and momentum. It was a clash of philosophies. One side fought for control, the other fought for progress. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began their push toward Paris, the meaning of D-Day crystallized for everyone involved, including Hitler himself. This was not just a military defeat, it was a strategic awakening. He finally understood that the war he had framed as enemies divided by borders was, in reality, a unified front driven by shared purpose. Nations with different cultures, languages, and histories had coordinated on a scale Germany could no longer match. The Allies had learned how to work together. Germany had learned too late what isolation costs. Inside Hitler's inner circle, morale collapsed, confidence vanished. Conversations turned defensive. Blame replaced planning. Hope narrowed to unrealistic weapons and imagined reversals. But the truth was already moving through Europe on steel tracks and marching boots. Paris would be liberated. Belgium would fall. The Rhine would be crossed. And it all traced back to one realization that began forming on June 6, 1944. D-Day was not an American war. It was an Allied one. That distinction mattered, because wars are not won by numbers alone. They are won by cooperation, adaptability, and the willingness to share sacrifice. Hitler had bet everything on control through fear. The Allies invested in trust. History remembers the difference. When the war ended less than a year later, analysts would look back at Normandy not just as a battlefield, but as a turning point in how modern conflict was fought, and how authoritarian certainty collapses when faced with collective resolve. D-Day didn't end the war, but it ended the illusion that Nazi Germany could still win it. And in that moment, when Hitler finally understood the scale of what he faced, the outcome became inevitable. Not because one nation struck hardest, but because many stood together,